All right, we're going to be in Genesis chapters 31, or rather 32 and 33. We were in Genesis 31 last week, and so we're still in that section of Genesis where we're looking at the life of Jacob. And really for the next couple chapters, that's going to be the case. Eventually the baton is going to be handed off to his son Joseph, but we're not quite there yet. And so in Genesis 31, last week we saw really the wrapping up of Jacob's time in Haran, where he had been serving, or at least tolerating, his uncle Laban. And we talked about all of the various events over the past two chapters, Jacob's marriage to Laban's two daughters, the other two handmaiden wives that he took on board, the 11 sons and many daughters that were born. Then we saw last week the departure, or at least the intent to depart from Haran. We saw his flight. We saw Laban chasing him down, and then we ended with the last half of Genesis 31, where Laban finally catches up with Jacob, but due to God's intervention, so Jacob's life is spared and a covenant is made, and more or less he and Laban draw a line in the sand and say that neither one of us is going to cross this line to harm the other. And that's where things were left. And so in one sense, we sort of would expect, or at least I would like, if I didn't know the story, I would like to kind of see that Jacob's had this time of turmoil. He's been away for 20 years. Now he's finally back home, and everything is going to be great. But that's not exactly what happens. The problem is that Jacob really has more than one adversary, right? He kind of had you could call it kind of like the external adversary of Laban, and he's now finally overcome Laban, but he still has this internal or this family adversary of Esau, which really was the entire reason why Jacob had left the Promised Land in the first place. And so a few verses all the way back from Genesis 27, going back 20 years in time, you recall here these events. And so this is after Jacob had deceived his father, and Esau was a bit upset at having lost the blessing. And so Genesis 27, verse 41, we covered this a few weeks back. It says, "And so Esau hated Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, 'The days of mourning for my father are at hand, and then I will kill my brother Jacob.'" And so Esau has in his head that so his father is about to pass away. We know in reality it was going to be yet 43 years before his father would pass away, but he thought it was time, and he intended to kill his brother. And this is why Jacob had fled. And so verse 42, "And the words of Esau, her older son, were told to Rebekah. And so she called Jacob, her younger son, and said, 'Surely your brother Esau comforts himself concerning you by intending to kill you.' Then she gives this direction, 'Now therefore, my son, obey my voice, arise and flee to my brother Laban in Haran,'" which is where he's been for the past 20 years. And she says this, verse 43, "Now therefore, my son, obey my voice, arise and flee to my brother Laban in Haran, and stay with him a few days." Now, in my mind, that means 2 or 3, right? A few days, a short trip. And maybe Jacob even is aware of the family history that when his father was seeking a wife, his grandfather, Abraham, had sent his servant Eliezer to Haran to find a wife. And he found Rebekah, his mom, and it was just one night that Eliezer spent in Haran, right? And so the pattern is you go off to Haran, you get a wife, you come back. That the last trip was just an overnight stay. And so mom says a few days. I'm thinking 2 or 3 days. But of course we know those few days turned into 20 plus years. And she did say this, again, verse 44, "Stay with him a few days until your brother's fury turns away, until your brother's anger turns away from you, and he forgets what you have done to him. Then I will send and bring you from there. Why should I be bereaved also of you both in one day?" And so she says, go for a few days, and I'm going to send and get you, right? And so for 20 years, he's been waiting for his mother to send and get him, right? And probably what happened is she passed away, right? And of course we say that because she never sent for him, and we actually never hear from her again in the rest of the story. That once Jacob gets back to the promised land, while he does meet his brother, we'll see in today's chapters, and he does actually meet his dad again. He never actually meets his mom again. And so his mom probably passed away while he was gone. And so that's sort of, I guess, where we are by way of the context. And so Genesis 32 and verse 1, it says this. This is after the making of the covenant with Laban. So Jacob went on his way, and the angels of God met him. And when Jacob saw them, he said, "This is God's camp." And he called the name of the place Mahanaim. And so the angels of God meet him. And the last time that Jacob met the angels of God, you recall, was back in chapter 28 when he was fleeing. And so let me go back. And so I read you got Genesis 27. Here's Genesis 28, verse 13. And behold, the Lord stood above it. This is the stairway to heaven. He says, "I am the Lord God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and your descendants." So that's part of the Abrahamic covenant back from Genesis 12. I'm going to give you land. "And your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. You shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south." And so that is the personal aspect of the covenant. There's going to be great descendants that come from you. And he says, "And in your seed, all the families of the earth shall be blessed," which is Genesis 12, verse 3, which is that universal aspect. And you recall this great covenant, right? The promise of land, which is the national aspect, promise of descendants, that's the personal aspect, and the promise of universal blessing, which is an allusion to the Messiah, and that's the universal aspect. And so God had told Jacob when he was leaving the promised land, which was kind of ironic, right? He's leaving the promised land, and God appears and says, "Hey, I'm going to do these things from you," and says, "I'm going to keep you safe until you come back." Well, 20 years apart, now he's coming back into the promised land, and here are these angels again, right? And I mentioned it last week as class was ending. There's actually sort of an important kind of biblical theme here that I can't totally trace out because we don't have time, but you recall back from Genesis chapter 3, we were there like 3 months ago. In Genesis 3, when Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden, which in a sense is a picture of the promised land, that God put an angel at the border into the promised land with a flaming sword, right, that went back and forth, right, and that was to keep them out of the promised land. And so now you're going back into the promised land, and what do you meet? You meet an angel, right? Because the Garden of Eden was symbolic of the promised land, and the promised land is essentially where God's people meet with him, and we now are looking forward to the promised land temporarily of heaven, but eventually new heavens and new earth. And whenever you see a picture of heaven in Scripture, what's the commonality? There's always sort of angels there, right? And so the idea that angels kind of guard or are in the promised land is an important biblical theme, which is why Jacob meets an angel here, going back into the promised land, because this is what God has promised. This is what angels do. Angels worship God forever and ever and ever. And I mean, what do they say in God's presence? Holy, holy, holy. Y'all know the hymn, right? That's Isaiah 6, right? And so I imagine that the angels are probably singing that hymn here as Jacob meets them. It doesn't actually say that, but there they are. But he concludes, this is God's camp, or this is where God dwells, as is signified by the angels that he saw, which are the same angels he saw when he left 20 years earlier. And so he names the place Mahanaim, which means the double camp, and it's the idea that, hey, I saw angels here before at this place. And this is actually not far from the place where he departed 20 years earlier. And so verse 3, "Then Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau his brother in the land of Seir in the country of Edom." And so I imagine that Jacob, I mean, as you and I would have been, I imagine that Jacob was a bit anxious with this return, because he's been told by God to return, right? And so, I mean, earlier in the previous chapter, it was back up in Genesis 31 and verse 3, It says, the Lord appeared to Jacob and told him, return to the land of your fathers and to your family, and I will be with you. And so he never gets word from his mom, but he gets word from God, hey, go back home, go back to the promised land. But nevertheless, he's been away for 20 years, and the last thing that he heard from his brother was, I'm going to kill you, right? And so we do recognize, I guess, that with time, emotions sort of change and shift. But this wasn't just sort of a small thing that Jacob had done to Esau, right? He had stolen his blessing. He had bought his birthright and then stolen his blessing. And so I'm sure he's wondering, like, is Esau kind of going to be over that? Or is he still going to be upset? And so he sends messengers, to go and kind of, I guess, to test the ground, to see is Esau still upset or is he not? Verse 4, and Jacob commanded them, saying, speak thus to my lord Esau. Thus your servant Jacob says, I have dwelt with Laban and stayed there until now. I have oxen and donkeys and flocks and male and female servants, and I have sent to tell my lord that I may find favor in your sight. And so we're going to see here that Jacob, he's a fairly utilitarian, sort of pragmatic guy. And so it makes sense. You're not sure if your brother's upset or not, and so you send out folks to kind of check and, hey, see if he's upset. And hey, tell him, by the way, I've got a bunch of stuff, right? Implication being that, hey, I've got stuff. I'm coming back to dwell, near you or among you. And so my stuff can be your stuff. And hey, more importantly, I'm not coming back to take your stuff. I've got stuff, right? And so again, I think it's just a pretty logical and pretty good way, to kind of break the ice and to test the waters and head back home. Verse 6, and then the messengers returned to Jacob, saying, we came to your brother Esau, and he also is coming to meet you. So far, so good. And 400 men are with him. That's the part that you don't want to hear, right? And so, now, thinking through this, it's you got to kind of ask yourself, why is Esau coming with 400 men, right? In my mind, again, maybe we can ask these folks once we get to heaven. I'm not sure that Esau's going to be there, but we can ask Jacob at least. What does Esau actually like? What is he feeling, and what is he thinking? I imagine that he's feeling a bit conflicted, right, and maybe a bit unsure. Like, hey, my brother, stole the blessing. He bought the birthright. He's coming back. Is he coming back to attack me? I haven't seen him in 20 years, right? And what's going to happen? And so you'd rather be safe than sorry. And so you bring your entire posse with you, right? 400 men, because you really sort of don't know maybe what is going to happen. And so I don't think necessarily his intent was necessarily to attack his brother. I think he was just sort of hedging his bet, which in my mind seems actually to be a pretty wise thing to do, right? Because, again, you haven't seen your brother in 20 years, and so, what's going to happen and what's it going to be like? And so 400 men coming with him. As verse 7, and so Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, as you and I would have been. And so he takes here really I think a practical step. It's one of three things he does. And so Jacob was afraid and distressed, and he divided the people that were with him, and the flocks and the herds and the camels, into two companies. And he said, if Esau comes to the one company and attacks it, then the other company which is left, it might escape. And so again, it just seems kind of real practical here, right? That, hey, you don't know your brother's intent. He's got 400 guys. Surely Jacob had a bunch of guys as well, because it says back up in verse 5, I have oxen, donkeys, flocks, and male and female servants. And he has this great and massive collection of animals, which is going to require a lot of shepherds and folks to take care of them. And so, does he have more guys than Esau? I don't know. But just kind of practically, let's put two parties, and that, hey, if one party is attacked, the other might escape. Again, it's kind of the whole idea maybe of diversification, right? Don't put all your money in one stock, right? Diversify. Again, just kind of common sense here, right? Verse 9, and then Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham, and God of my father Isaac, the Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your family, and I will deal well with you. So he's quoting God back from Genesis 31, verse 3, and again, verse 13 of the previous chapter. And this actually is a pretty good, I think, kind of model here. In your prayers, I think God actually likes it when we quote God's promises back to him, right? Because why would he not, right? And so God, and you have promised, to protect me. You have promised to never leave me nor forsake me. God, you have promised that if you raise up a child in the way he should go, he will not depart from it. Quote God back to himself, right? Remind God, not like he's forgotten, but remind God of his promises, because that's a way to remind ourselves of God's promises. And so here Jacob prays, and he simply just quotes God, what God had said earlier, which again I think is a great way to pray. And he recognizes in verse 10, he says, I am not worthy of the least of all the mercies and of the truth which you have shown your servant. For I crossed over this Jordan with my staff, and now I have become two companies. And so, again, I think great thing to do here, is to pray and to ask for protection. But I do notice that before he prayed, he took the practical step of dividing his stuff up into two companies. And I would have rather that he prayed first, right? While I think Jacob, like us, he's coming along, right? And he's becoming, hopefully more spiritually mature. Nevertheless, he was practical before he was spiritual, right? And on top of that, he is distressed and he's anxious, but God has promised him repeatedly that I'm going to take care of you, right? Even back when he left in Genesis 28, God told him, I will bring you back safely to the land. And God had told him, now it's time to go back to the land, I'm going to protect you, right? And so he has that promise, but nevertheless, he's anxious. But again, this is kind of how we operate, right? We know what God has promised us, but yet we're still all the time anxious and distressed about the very things that God said that he will take care of, right? But because we don't see his hand at work, we doubt that he's at work, and we become anxious as well. And so we can't throw stones here, I guess, at Jacob, because we all live in glass houses. But this is his approach. Verse 11, he says, deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, lest he come and attack me and the mothers and the children. For you said, I will surely treat you well, and make your descendants as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. So there he is again. He's quoting God back to God, right? And so, again, it's kind of like he's of two minds, right? Hey, I have these promises. I know the promises well enough to quote them back to you in prayer, but the reason why I'm praying is sort of because I'm doubting all this and I'm distressed and anxious, right? Which, again, makes me feel really good, because this is how I kind of act as well. And don't pretend like you walk on water in your bathtub. I know you don't, right? And so this is all of us. Verse 13, and so he lodged there that same night, and he took what came to his hand as a present for Esau, his brother. So again, this is a really good model, right? I think the order is wrong, but you have a problem, right? And so you take practical steps. He divides into two companies. You take spiritual steps. You pray, and you pray God back to himself, which you should do first. He did second. And now he's going to take this kind of financial step, if you will, where he's going to take 550 of his animals, which, by way kind of context, this was a massive present that he gives, right? And so I know that you and I, most of us probably have a hard time sort of valuing animals and how much a gift is worth. But especially during this day and time, this much livestock was like a multi-million-dollar gift he's giving, right? And so it says that he took what came to his hand as a present for Esau, his brother, 200 female goats, 20 male goats, 200 ewes and 20 rams, 30 milk camels with their colts, 40 cows and 10 bulls, 20 female donkeys and 10 foals. And he delivered them to the hand of his servants, and every drove by itself. And he said to his servants, and so there's 5 kind of separate droves here of animals. And each of the servants is supposed to say, pass over before me, and put some distance between successive droves. He tells them that. And he commanded the first one, saying, when Esau my brother meets you and asks you, saying, to whom do these belong? And where are you going? And whose are these in front of you? Then you shall say, they are your servant Jacob's. It's a present sent to my lord Esau. And behold, he is also coming behind us. And so they don't say, and there's 4 more droves or 2 more droves, right? They just keep appearing, and they're hey, this is Jacob's stuff. He's giving it to you. And the idea here is kind of like wave upon wave of continual and overwhelming blessings upon Esau, right? And it's the idea he's trying to kind of blow him away and hence learn his favor or earn his favor. And so I was thinking about this last night and this morning, and kind of just trying to process this. There's a lot of verses, actually. I jotted down 3 of them here just from Proverbs. But there's a lot of examples and a lot of verses that actually commend this type of financial approach, which may seem a bit unusual, in one sense, but here are some verses. Proverbs 18:16, Solomon says, "A man's gift makes room for him and brings him before great men." Right? A gift, lavish gift here, right? That it might actually kind of make room for you before a great man, and Esau was a great man, had 400 guys with him, right? Proverbs 17, verse 8, "A present is a precious stone in the eyes of its possessor, and wherever he turns, he will prosper." Right? So again, kind of similar thing. Proverbs 21, verse 14, "A large gift pacifies great anger." Right? And so again and again, like these teachings of gifts that make room for you, or gifts that pacify anger. And if you just even sort of think about it, there are some other examples. I come up with just a few here. I'm sure there's more than this, but like later on, when Jacob goes down to Egypt to see Joseph, he doesn't know it's Joseph. And like the second time he sends his sons down to Egypt, and they've said like, "Hey, the man is like, he's got all this glory and power, and he was upset with us, all that." Jacob puts together a gift of honey and different things, and sends this gift down to Joseph. It's Genesis 45, verse 11. It's kind of the same thing. Puts a gift together to earn favor with the ruler, which was actually his son. I thought of 1 Samuel 30, verse 26, when David was on the run and was over in Philistia and was trying to soften things up back home in Israel, that he was attacking the Philistine cities and getting plunder. And it says that he kept sending gifts back to the leader of Israel, as presents for them. And so again, a guy giving gifts, trying to soften the ground, right, because he was going to be king. Or when David met Nabal, and David's going to go and kill everyone, and Abigail puts together this big gift and brings it to David to kind of say, like, "Hey, don't kill everybody, right? It's going to be okay." And so again, these examples of gifts sort of being put together and being given to make room or to pacify anger, right? Which again, it seems sort of a bit surprising to me, right? Because like, where is the line between like righteous gift and unrighteous bribe, right? And probably kind of more in our context, like when someone like is giving a gift like to get something out of someone or to make room, we think more like a bribery, right, than we do of gifts. And so it's I guess maybe the intent, maybe behind the gift might be part of it. Whereas a bribe would be viewed as, well, don't do that, right? But a gift can be a good thing, as Solomon teaches. And so again, like, how do we tell the difference? It's all the missionaries that we send out. From the college and the seminary over at Southeastern. It's always interesting to me. I can't tell you how many discussions with folks going to countries like where bribery is just sort of the usual thing. And they're like, "Well, hey, is it okay if I go and I engage in bribery?" Right? And it's a really important question, right? Because if you don't, you might find yourself like never getting anywhere or doing anything, right? I remember my a former colleague of mine who I wrote a book with. He went over to Ukraine. He was telling me this story about when he was first there. He had a BMW, was the company car he was given to drive, which that was the mistake because it looked like he had money even though he didn't. And so he, like the first week there, he's driving from his house to the place where he worked, a school he was teaching at, and he was obeying all the traffic laws, and he got pulled over. He was just, like the story, he's like, so the cop pulls me over, and I'm sitting there, he's behind me with the lights on, and I think he's kind of running my plate or whatever, and like a minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, like 15 minutes go by, and the guy's like still there. And so he thought, well, maybe he's going to let me go because he hasn't come yet. So he pulled away, and which was another mistake. And the guys followed him and pulled him over again, and they sat there for another 5 minutes. And so finally, he just got out of the car and went to the cop, and the cop kind of was waving around like, get in the passenger seat. So he sits in the passenger seat, and the cop's like, papers, registration, and he gave him the papers and registration and kind of thumbed through them. And said, okay, listen, this is how it works. I know you're not from here, but here in our country, like when you get pulled over, you get out of the car and get in the police's car. That's how it works. Like, I'm not going to get out. It's cold out there, right? Like you get out, you get into our car, you then give me your papers. In your papers, you put some money. I look through your papers, I find the money, I take the money, give it back, and I let you go. That's how it works. He's like, okay, thank you. That wasn't part of his training, right? And so he called me up. He's like, is this legal? He's like, I hadn't been doing it, but man, I'm getting pulled over like every third day. I'm like, well, number one, like, get a junker car. I mean, first of all, right? But bribery versus a gift, or how do you tell the difference, right? It's I don't know. It certainly is. It can be challenging, right? But I have noted that. I don't know about the bribery part. I can't recall an instance where I bribed someone, although I probably have, because I'm a scoundrel like you are. But I tend to be. I'm not bragging. I just kind of the way things have to go. And so at the seminary where Chuck and I work, the president has a rule that no one knows. You don't know if people know who you are, right? So that when you go out to eat, you need to give a big tip. Because I don't want to hear that you're chintzy, right? Because it might actually hinder the gospel, right? Because you're only given 10% or whatever. And so I'm a pretty big tipper. Just because I have to be, and I want to be too, I guess. And so, but I've noticed that when we go back to a restaurant, right? And you get the same server, you get a lot better service if you were a big tipper the previous time, right? And I'm like, well, this guy thinks maybe I bribed him last time to get better service. Like he's going to bring me a free drink this time or whatever. Well, that's not what I was after, right? And so, yeah, it does make room for you, right? Whether it's a gift or it's a bribe, well, again, what's the difference? I'm not sure I can exactly pinpoint it, but probably your heart could tell you if the gift was actually a bribe. But whatever the case is, so Jacob prepares this lavish gift for his brother. And we're in verse 19 now. It says, and so he commanded the second, the third, and all who follow in the drove, saying, in this manner you shall speak to Esau when you find him. And also say, behold, your servant Jacob is behind us. For he said, I will appease him with a present that goes before me. So it was a present for the purpose of appeasing, but apparently it wasn't a bribe. And afterward, he said, I will see his face, and perhaps he will accept me. And so the present went on before him, and he himself lodged that night in the camp. And so that brings us down to verse 22, which is one of the more well-known passages maybe in the book of Genesis. This is the account where Jacob wrestles with God. And so it says, and Jacob arose that night and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed over the ford of the Jabbok. Jabbok is actually the name of the river, but Jabbok means wrestling, and so it was probably named afterwards. I doubt that it was named wrestling coincidentally, where he wrestles with God here beforehand. Verse 23, he took them and sent them over the brook, and sent them over what he had. And then Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. And now, when he saw that he did not prevail against him, he touched the socket of his hip, and the socket of Jacob's hip was out of joint as he wrestled with him. And he said, let me go, for the day breaks. Now, I got to question this whole kind of his hip being out of socket. I don't know if you ever had a dislocated socket before, but it's pretty painful, I can assure you. And so I don't know, maybe it was just sort of slightly off kilter. I doubt if his hip is sort of out of joint, he's still going to wrestle. But anyways, and they're wrestling all night. And the question is, does Jacob actually know with whom he's wrestling? Right? And I think actually we have to conclude that he does because of what he's going to say here coming up in a few verses. And there's also a commentary on this event. Don't turn there. Just jot it down and read it later. Over in the book of Hosea, Hosea 12, verses 3 through 5. So again, it's much later. But Hosea seems to indicate that Jacob knew that he was wrestling with the angel of the Lord which would traditionally be identified with Christ. And so here he's kind of having a wrestling match with Jesus all night, and he is not going to let him go. He says, middle of verse 26, but he said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. So the very fact that Jacob sought a blessing from the guy with whom he was wrestling seems to indicate that he thought that he was wrestling with at least an angel, if not God, because why would he be asking just a regular guy for a blessing, and why would he keep him all night and not let him go? I mean, if some stranger jumps me in the woods and we start wrestling and he wants to go, I'm going to let it go, right? You know what I'm saying? But if you think it's God, well, then maybe you're not going to let go. And so he said to him, verse 27, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. And he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed. So there's this theme, really, in Jacob's life. I'm not sure if you've kind of picked up on it over the previous 5 chapters. But, I mean, first of all, Jacob wrestles with his brother, right? He actually wrestles with his brother in the womb, comes out holding his heel, right? Then he wrestles with his father, I mean, to get the blessing. He then wrestles with his father-in-law, Laban, to get the wife he wants. Then he's wrestling with his wives over who's going to be pregnant. And now he's wrestling with God, right? And so, there's this wrestling with everyone. It's just a mark of the life here of Jacob. And as we talked about earlier, I mean, Jacob means deceiver or heel grabber, and Israel probably means, prince with God. There's some debate over exactly what it means. But whatever's happening, Jacob's name is changing. And now that he's going to be in the promised land, he's going to be in God's presence. In a sense, sort of his wrestling is now over. And this is actually what we would identify as the ratification of God's covenant with him. And we talked about this going back, it's been weeks now, but we talked about when covenants were made, that covenants were inaugurated, that they were announced, but then over a period of time, they kind of came into being, and finally they were ratified, and finally the covenant was fully in force. And this kind of is, I think, the ratification of the covenant. You say, how do you know that? Well, because of the name change, right? We talked about name changes earlier, back in Genesis 12. We talked about covenants having signs, and one of the signs of covenants being name changes. And even you and I have been invited into this new covenant, right? The covenant has been inaugurated. We're now followers of Christ. And one day we will go and be with his presence, the marriage supper of the Lamb. You can go and read in Revelation 3, it says that we will be given a new name even, right? Which is a name change even that we'll undergo. And we've already kind of actually undergone a name change. We're now Christian, right? And so this wrestling match and a name change. But then, verse 29, and then Jacob asks, saying, well, tell me your name, I pray. So I told you my name, so you tell me your name. Then the response, and the man said, why is it that you ask about my name? And he blessed him there. And I don't think here I don't think it's kind of like you shouldn't have asked me my name, or hey, I'm not going to tell you my name. I think it's why are you asking me my name? You already know my name. I think that's what he's saying, as is evidenced by the fact that you hang on and you wrestled all night, and you've been walking with me, or at least I've been walking with you for 20 years now. And so there's no need for you to ask my name. You already know me. Verse 30, and so Jacob called the name of the place Peniel. And Peniel actually means face of God. And he said, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved, just as he crossed over. Peniel crossed over Peniel, the sun rose on him, and he limped on his hip. Why is he limping? Because God knocked it out of joint or whatever, right? And it says, therefore, to this day, the children of Israel don't eat the muscle that shrank, which is on the hip socket, because he touched the socket of Jacob's hip and the muscle that shrank. And so the interesting is that actually, that idea of not eating, that part of an animal, that's actually not in later Jewish civil law, as is recorded in Scripture. But even to this day, Orthodox Jews still today don't eat that part, of an animal. And so it actually still is in play. But interesting, Jacob's naming here of the place. I have seen God face to face, he says, and my life is preserved. And so, while this verse is later on, Exodus 33, verse 20, you recall that when Moses wanted to see God's face, remember God said, no, he said, actually, no, you can't see my face. Actually, Exodus 33, verse 20, God said, you cannot see my face, for no man shall see me and live. So the idea that if you see God, you will die. And so then God put Moses in the cleft of the rock and put his hand over him, right? And he saw God's back only. And so the idea that you can't see God and live, but yet Jacob saw God and was alive. Of course, God can veil his glory in flesh, which he did in the incarnation. And then, everyone that saw Jesus didn't die, right? But seeing God sort of truly in his glory and being alive, that was the issue. And we've talked about this before in class, but here's the teaching here. I think, again, I mentioned this because I think a lot of people get this wrong. If you go back and you read the Jewish commentators on this idea, it wasn't that, like, if you saw God, that he would be so glorious and so brilliant and so holy that it would kind of like blow your mind and you would die. Like, that wasn't the teaching. The teaching was that if you were to see God in his holiness for who he truly is, in his complete light and his complete glory, it would so illuminate your own sinfulness and darkness that your knowledge of your true self would kill you, right? That was the teaching, right? And that actually is a really good teaching. And I'm sure we've all experienced that, right? Not that we've died, but like you've met people. I know that you know people who you would say are closer to God's throne than you are, right? A pastor or a deacon or someone you know as a spiritual mentor, someone that you meet that just walks with the Lord. And I don't know about you, but when I'm around those people in my life, just being in their presence, just like the light of Christ that they radiate, I start getting convicted about things that we aren't even talking about. Right? Some people, I'm just in their presence, and I know just how much they love Jesus. And I'm like, I need to be a better husband. I need to be a better dad. I need to be a better person. I'm a scoundrel, right? And it's just it's the light that shines off them, right? That it kills me, right? And it moves me, to kill my sin, hopefully, and become more like Christ. Well, imagine if you saw God in his complete holiness, right? This is why, Moses had to veil his face, right, later on. When he had been in God's presence, he's just a man. But being in God's presence, he so became like Christ that the people couldn't even be around him because his face shone. So he put a veil over his face, right? And so that was the teaching here. It's the idea that, hey, actually, I saw God, and I'm still alive. Was Jacob's teaching here. And so he's met God. He has sort of made peace with God. The covenant has been ratified. And now he's getting ready, chapter 33, to actually meet his brother Esau. And so verse 1, chapter 33. Now Jacob lifted his eyes, and he looked, and there Esau was coming, and with him were 400 men. And so he divided the children among them, among Leah, Rachel, and the two maidservants. And again, I got to sort of ask them in heaven, how did this go, right? Everyone knows who the favorite is, right? But when you're actually sort of putting them in groups and you're sending the ones that you like least first, most likely to be killed, I just can't imagine that Jacob was not on the couch that night. I don't know. It's but this is what he does, right? And so again, it's amazing, but it's the same thing for us. He's just actually spent an evening wrestling with God, right? He's been in God's presence, and things have ended well. He's gotten a blessing out of the whole deal. His hip hurts, but whenever you wrestle with God, something is going to be wrong after you're done with it, right? But he's just been in God's presence, and now immediately, next moment, he's worried again. He's dividing things up, right? But that's the same thing, right? You and I, you have a great day on Sunday, right? And then back to work on Monday, man, and you're just back in the pit of despair again, right? It's just almost all pastors quit on Monday, right? After a great day on Sunday, it's just the way it goes. We go from high to low. It's just how things happen. And so he sees Esau, and so he divides things up. Verse 2, and he put the maidservants and their children in front, right? And Leah and her children behind, and Rachel and Joseph last. And then he crossed over before them and bowed himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. And so do note that at least. He did cross over before them, right? So he actually went first and kind of led the charge. He bows down 7 times, which would have been a sign of great respect in this day and time. And I imagine that even at this point, Esau maybe doesn't even really know what he's going to do, but he's just gotten this lavish gift of 550 pieces of livestock. He sees this great company of people, and there's his brother, who he is still sort of on the fence about, bowing down, showing great respect 7 times. And so verse 4, Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. And so just as sort of Joseph has turned from a deceiver to generosity, so Jacob has turned. So Esau has turned from revenge to reconciliation. Verse 5, and he lifted his eyes and saw the woman and the children and said, and who were all these with you, right? Like, dude, you got 4 wives? what are you thinking? It's well, he actually had 4 wives too, if you recall. But it's been 20 years. And so we said, man, the children whom God has graciously given to your servants. Yep, these are all mine. Can't you tell? Verse 6, and the maidservants came near. They and their children, they bowed down. And Leah came near with her children, and they bowed down. Afterwards, Joseph and Rachel came, and they bowed down. And then Esau asked him, as I think rightly so, what do you mean by all this company which I met? And he said, these are to find favor in the sight of my Lord. And so he's like, no, it's actually a gift that I've given, to earn your favor. Doesn't even hide that fact. But Esau says, I have enough. My brother, keep what you have for yourself. And so he literally probably had enough, right? As a matter of fact, we learn later on he's actually called a prince. And so apparently over the 20 years that Jacob's been gone, Esau has excelled, which we would expect actually given the blessing that he received back in chapter 27 that his father did give him. It wasn't as great a blessing as Jacob, but it was a great blessing. So he's kind of become a prince. He's got 400 spare guys, to bring to a meeting. He probably has a lot of stuff. And so he says, I have enough, which is I think there's a big lesson there in those 3 words, right? Can you and I say, I have enough? Like knowing when you have enough is it's a hard determination, right? Because we're always worried about what's going to happen tomorrow. Well, he says he has enough. And Jacob said, no, please, if I have now found favor in your sight, then receive my present from my hand, inasmuch as I have seen your face, as though I had seen the face of God, which was an incredible statement because he had actually just seen God's face the previous night, right? And you were pleased with me. He says, please take my blessing that is brought to you because God has dealt graciously with me and because I have enough. And so they both say, I have enough. Actually, in Hebrew, it's 2 different words. Esau actually said, I have enough. Jacob actually said, I have everything, or I have all is the word. And so we urged him, and he finally took it, which is, again, I think is a good rule of thumb. It's a good thing actually to receive a gift from somebody. I've told you all before, like if you invite us out to dinner and you offer to pay, be sure that you mean it, right? Because I'm not going to push back. like some people, I'll pay. No, I'll pay. No, if you say I'll pay, I'm like, good, right? So because I want to receive your gift and be gracious to you, right? And so make sure you mean it if you offer So he does take it. Verse 12. Then Esau said, "Let's take our journey and let us go, and I will go before you." And this actually this is really remarkable, right? Because remember, the last time that he had seen Esau was literally plotting to kill him. And arguably, Jacob needed killing, right? Because then he had deceived him and had taken his blessing. And so I think he was justly upset. Yes, he despised his birthright and he sold it for some soup. And we get all that. But he had been deceived in regard to the blessing, right? And so I don't know that necessarily his anger was all that much out of place. It's wrong to want to kill somebody. But, great anger, I think it might have been warranted. But now, man, they're hugging and they're kissing. And he's inviting him to come and live with him, down in the southern part of the Promised Land, down by Moab and Edom. Verse 13, But Jacob said to him, My Lord knows that the children are weak, and the flocks and the herds which are nursing are with me. If the men should drive them hard one day, all the flock will die. So, I've read this narrative in the past, almost like this is like another deception maybe by Jacob, like in the sense that he goes back, and Jacob is a deceiver, and Jacob really doesn't want to sort of live with his brother, and his brother asks him to come, hey, live near me. He's like, well, no, I can't go. Like this is kind of this Jacob trying to deceive his brother again, and to not maybe live near him. But all the commentators I read said, no, actually, this is actually probably the truth, right? He's actually been driving thousands of animals hard, trying to escape from Laban, right? And that this actually is something that would have resulted in the death of some livestock. Again, I'm not a farmer. I've never experienced that, but I think this actually was a truth that he was actually sharing. It wasn't necessarily a deception. Verse 14, he says, And please let my Lord go on ahead before his servant, and I will lead on slowly at a pace which the livestock that go before me can handle, and the children that are able to endure, until I come to my Lord in Seir. And so it seems like he's like, hey, I'm going to go slow, and eventually I'll get there. But I don't think that you have to read it like that. I think he's just simply saying, hey, you know what, I'm not going to go because the animals can't take it. Hey, and eventually I'm actually going to come and visit you down where you live, which is what he actually does. And so I don't know this is necessarily, again, a deception on his part. But Esau says, now let me leave with you some of the people who are with me. And so, again, I've kind of read that in the past almost as if like Esau doesn't really trust Jacob. Right? Well, if you're not going to come with me, like let me leave some people with you to make sure that you kind of stay in your place, and don't marshal an army to come and kill me. But most commentators say this actually was probably just customary, that when you had a rich visitor come visit, that you would offer them some protection. And so I think that simply could be the case here. But he said, what need is there? Let me find favor in the sight of my Lord. So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir with his bounty of new animals, I guess. And Jacob journeyed to Succoth to build himself a house. And so this actually is not far from where they had met. He just actually takes about a 10-mile journey to the west. And it says he makes booths for his livestock, and therefore the name of that place is Succoth, which means place of booths. And in a sense, it kind of makes sense, because this actually is where Abraham had lived when he first went to the Promised Land. And so now Jacob first goes into the Promised Land. There's this place that's open. There's lots of pasture land. It's where your grandfather had lived, and he decides to dwell there. I don't think he's trying to escape his brother necessarily. I think in a sense it just makes sense, given the condition of his family, his flocks, and the availability of land there, and the pasture, and the family history. So verse 18, it says, And then Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, when he came from Padanaram, which is Haran, and he pitched his tent there before the city. And he bought the parcel of land where he had pitched his tent from the children of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money. And so I wonder sort of about this, in the sense of he actually buys the land. And so I wonder if, in his mind, if the fact that he had been promised the entire land, if he kind of is viewing maybe the purchase of some of the land as a part of maybe what he was supposed to do, maybe. And just as Grandpa Abraham bought a small piece of land to bury his wife, that now you're there, pretty much in the same region, and you're going to buy some land because this is actually how you get land. Not sure exactly what was going on. Maybe it's just that he wanted a place to call his own, right? And apparently he had plenty of money and plenty of stuff, and it wasn't a big deal. And so it says, verse 20, And then he erected an altar there and called it El Elohe Israel, God, the God of Israel, which is the first time he calls God that. It's the first time he's had the name Israel, but it's really the first time that he actually refers to God as his God. Previously, God was the God of his father, or the God of Abraham. Now he's the God of Israel. And so again, the first time that's the case. And this may be a fulfillment of the promise that was made back in Genesis 28. You recall that when Jacob first left this place, that he told God, man, if you'll keep me safe and you'll bless me and bring me back here, and I'll give you 10% and I'll worship you, right? And so this may be a fulfillment of that promise, although that promise was made in Bethel. This promise, or this act here, is fulfilled by the city of Shechem, which is about 5 miles from Bethel, but it's in the same general region. And so this may be a promise, kind of a bookend to that promise that was made 20 plus years earlier. But one thing here, just kind of as a side note to kind of to note, it doesn't say here that Jacob dug a well, but he bought some land, he lived there. Obviously, he had a well, right? In order to have water. Years and years later, y'all know the story in John 4 of Jesus meeting the woman at the well. And y'all know all that happened there. And if you go and you read that narrative, what you find is that Jesus was in Shechem, and actually in John 4:6, the well is actually called Jacob's well. And so it's probably the same well that Jacob dug and made here, that Jesus is in the same place in John 4, again, hundreds and hundreds of years later, and meets that lady, and all that happens there. That takes place. And again, y'all know that story over in John 4. All right. Well, once again, more to say, but time's gone, so I will close this in prayer, and we'll be dismissed. Father, we are thankful for your word. We're thankful for your work in the lives of your people. Lord, just as we read this narrative of Jacob, and we see your promises, we see his faith, both strong and weak. Lord, so we see ourselves in Jacob. And Lord, just as you were patient with Jacob, so we're thankful for your long-suffering, your patience with us. We're thankful, Lord, for your promises to us. Lord, help us not to forget who you are, who we are, our dependence upon you. And I trust, Lord, as we look into your word each week, each day even, that we would see you more clearly and become more like you because of what we read. We do pray all this in Christ's name. Amen. We'll see y'all next week.